"Oh, we didn't think you'd stay long," my daughter-in-law said with a small, polite smile, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of explaining why there was no place for me at my own grandson's birthday table. I stood there for a second longer than anyone noticed, holding the gift I had carefully wrapped the night before, a remote-controlled truck Ethan had pointed at weeks ago in a store window, his eyes wide with that quiet kind of hope children don't always voice. The backyard was decorated in bright colors, balloons tied to every chair, a long rectangular table set neatly with paper plates and matching napkins, each seat marked with a name card written in looping cursive. I scanned the table once, then again, slower this time. Daniel, Ashley, Ethan, friends, neighbors, even a seat for Ashley's coworker I had met only once. But not mine. Not even an empty space where a chair might have been forgotten. Just a clean break in the line, as if the table itself had decided I didn't belong. It must have been an oversight, someone behind me murmured, but the words didn't reach anyone who mattered. Ashley tilted her head slightly, her expression still soft, still gracious. "You can just sit wherever, Margaret," she added, already turning back to greet another guest, her voice lifting, bright and effortless, as though she hadn't just erased me from the arrangement she had clearly planned down to the last detail. I smiled. It was the kind of smile you learn over a lifetime, the one that keeps your dignity intact when everything else feels like it's quietly slipping away. I set the gift down on the corner of the table, careful not to disturb the symmetry, and looked around for a chair. There were none left. Not a single spare. Not by accident. Not by chance. I could feel it in the way the space was arranged, in the way no one moved, no one offered, no one even suggested shifting over. Conversations continued. Laughter rose and fell like nothing had happened. Daniel was at the far end, pouring lemonade into plastic cups, his back half turned to me, his shoulders slightly tense in a way only a mother would notice. For a brief moment, I waited for him to look up, to catch my eye, to say something, anything, but he didn't. Or maybe he chose not to. I couldn't tell which felt worse. I stepped away from the table, slowly, deliberately, as if I had simply decided I preferred the shade near the fence. The grass was soft beneath my shoes, the hum of conversation blending with the distant sound of traffic from the street beyond. Children ran past me, their laughter bright and unburdened, Ethan among them, his face lit with excitement, unaware of the small, quiet shift that had just taken place. I watched him for a moment, letting that image settle, holding on to it like something steady. Then I turned my gaze back to the table. Ashley was seated now, leaning slightly toward her guests, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm as she spoke, her smile practiced, perfect. She didn't look in my direction again. Not once. It wasn't anger I felt. Not even surprise. It was something colder. Something clearer. Like finally seeing a pattern you had spent years trying to dismiss. There had been other moments. Smaller ones. Easier to explain away. Invitations that arrived late. Holidays that changed plans at the last minute. Phone calls that grew shorter, less frequent, until they felt more like obligations than connections. Each one, on its own, had seemed harmless. Understandable. Life gets busy. People forget. But standing there, with no seat, no name, no place, I realized it had never been about forgetting. It had always been about making space, just not for me. I folded my hands in front of me, feeling the familiar steadiness return, the same quiet strength that had carried me through years of raising a family, of building a home, of putting others first without question. I didn't need to ask what this meant. I didn't need an explanation. The absence said everything. And for the first time, I stopped trying to fill it. I remained near the fence long enough for it to look intentional, as if I preferred distance over company, as if this had been my choice all along. The afternoon sun shifted slowly across the yard, casting longer shadows over the neatly arranged table, and still no one noticed that I had never sat down. Or perhaps they noticed and chose not to act, which is a different kind of silence, one that carries weight. I watched as plates were passed around, slices of cake carefully handed from one person to another, each movement smooth and practiced, like a scene that had been rehearsed without me. Ashley laughed at something someone said, her voice light and effortless, and for a moment I studied her face, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of guilt, but there was none. Only comfort, only control. Daniel finally glanced in my direction, just for a second, and when our eyes met, he gave a small nod, the kind you give a stranger in a hallway, polite but distant, before quickly looking away again. That small gesture settled something inside me, something I had been holding on to without realizing it. I had thought there would be a moment, some interruption, a correction, but there was not. This was not a mistake waiting to be fixed. This was the plan unfolding exactly as intended. I walked toward the side of the house where a stack of folding chairs leaned against the wall, still tied together with a thin plastic cord, untouched and used. I paused there, my hand hovering for a moment before I let it fall back to my side. I did not reach for one. I did not bring it to the table. Instead, I turned back toward the yard, letting my gaze move slowly across the faces gathered there, taking them in one by one, not with anger, but with clarity. These were people who could continue eating, laughing, celebrating, while someone who had once held this family together stood without a place. That realization did not sting the way it might have years ago. It settled, quiet and cold, like a truth that had finally found its shape. Ethan ran past me again, this time stopping just long enough to tug at my sleeve, asking if I had seen the cake yet, his voice full of excitement, his world still simple, still untouched by the undercurrents that moved beneath moments like this. I smiled at him, a real smile this time, and told him it looked perfect because it did. None of this was his doing. None of this belonged to him. He nodded quickly and ran back to his friends, leaving me standing exactly where I had been, except now I understood something I had not before. I was not being slowly pushed aside. I had already been moved. Quietly. Completely. And the only person who had not accepted it yet was me. The music shifted to something louder as the candles were brought out, a cheerful song playing through small speakers placed near the patio door, and everyone gathered closer to the table, tightening the circle I had never been part of. I stayed where I was, just far enough to see everything clearly, close enough that no one could claim they did not notice me if they chose to look. But no one did. Ashley leaned forward, adjusting the candles on the cake with careful precision, her movements neat, deliberate, as though every detail mattered except the one that had been left out. Daniel stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder, guiding him into position for the photos. "Everyone ready?" Ashley called out, her voice bright, practiced, the perfect host. Phones were lifted, smiles arranged, the moment framed exactly as it was meant to be remembered. I watched as they counted down together, their voices blending into a single cheerful rhythm, and then the candles were blown out, applause filling the yard, quick and easy, like nothing had ever been missing. For a brief second, Ethan looked past the table, his eyes searching, and when they found me, he waved, small and quick, as if he was not entirely sure he was supposed to. I lifted my hand in return, keeping my smile steady, not wanting to confuse him, not wanting to make him question a world that still made sense to him. Then the moment passed, just like that, and he turned back to the people around him, pulled again into the center where he belonged. Plates were handed out again, slices of cake disappearing one by one, conversations picking up where they had left off, the rhythm of the gathering continuing without interruption. I noticed how naturally it all flowed, how easily a space could close once it had been adjusted, how quickly people adapted to an absence if it was presented as normal. I had spent years believing that presence mattered, that showing up, helping, remembering birthdays, cooking meals, holding everything together through quiet effort would secure a place that could not be taken away. But standing there, watching a celebration move forward without me, I understood something I had never fully allowed myself to see. A place is not held by what you give. It is held by whether others decide you still belong. And that decision, once made, does not announce itself with loud words or open conflict. It arrives like this. Subtle, polite, final. I let my eyes move across the yard one last time, not searching anymore, just observing. The decorations, the laughter, the carefully arranged table, all of it looked exactly as it should from the outside. There was no scene, no raised voices, nothing anyone could point to and call wrong. And that was what made it so effective. Because nothing had been broken. I had simply been removed. Quietly. Completely. And everyone else had agreed to continue as if nothing had changed. As the afternoon began to settle into that slow, golden quiet that comes after the noise of celebration, I found myself drifting further from the center of the yard, not because anyone asked me to, but because there was no reason left to stay close. The laughter softened, conversations broke into smaller circles, and people began gathering their things, thanking Ashley for hosting, complimenting the decorations, the food, the perfect execution of the day. I had heard those same compliments for years, only they had once been directed at me. I used to be the one who planned these gatherings down to the smallest detail, the one who remembered which child preferred chocolate over vanilla, who stayed up the night before tying ribbons around goodie bags, who made sure every chair was counted, every place set, every guest seen. I remembered standing in kitchens that smelled of sugar and butter, checking lists I had written in careful handwriting, making sure nothing was forgotten. Back then, I believed that if you gave enough of yourself to a family, if you showed up consistently, quietly, reliably, you would become something permanent, something that could not simply be set aside. But memory has a way of rearranging itself when you look at it from a different place. Small things I had once dismissed began to return with sharper edges. The year I was told dinner would be just immediate family, only to see photos later of a full table that did not include me. The afternoon I arrived early to help decorate, only to be told everything had already been taken care of, my hands left empty, my presence unnecessary. The holiday calls that became shorter, then delayed, then missed entirely, each one explained with a reason that sounded reasonable. On its own, I had accepted all of it at the time, smoothing over each moment with understanding, telling myself that life changes, that families grow, that roles shift. But standing there now, with the echoes of today still lingering in the air, I saw the pattern in a way I never had before. It was not a series of isolated moments. It was a quiet progression, a gradual repositioning, not loud enough to confront, not clear enough to challenge, but steady enough to reshape everything without resistance. I looked toward the table again, now half cleared, paper plates stacked, crumbs brushed aside, as if the day itself was being packed away, leaving no trace of what had been missing. Ashley moved easily among the guests, her hand occasionally resting on Daniel's arm, guiding conversations, closing the day with the same effortless control she had opened it with. Daniel followed her lead without question, his role simplified, his attention directed where she chose. I realized then that I had not just lost a seat at a table. I had lost the position I once held without ever noticing when it was taken. And perhaps the most unsettling part was not that it had happened, but that it had been allowed to happen, slowly, quietly, without a single moment that demanded I stop and see it for what it was. Until now. I was about to leave when a familiar voice stopped me, soft but certain, the kind that carries weight without needing to be loud. Margaret, wait. I turned slightly and saw Linda Parker making her way toward me, her steps careful, her expression not forced like the others, but thoughtful, almost concerned. She had been my neighbor for over 20 years, long enough to recognize the difference between a mistake and a pattern. She did not smile the way people do when they want to avoid discomfort. She looked directly at me, as if she had already seen everything that had happened and chosen not to ignore it. I have been watching, she said quietly, lowering her voice just enough so it would not carry beyond us. That was not an accident. I did not respond right away. I did not need to. The words settled into place, confirming what I had already begun to understand. Linda glanced briefly toward the table, where Ashley was now handing out small party favors, her movements still smooth, still composed, then back at me. There was a full seating plan, she continued, her tone calm but firm. I saw her checking it twice before guests arrived. Every name, every chair. Nothing was left to chance. I let that sit for a moment, feeling how easily the last bit of uncertainty disappeared. Not forgotten, not overlooked. Decided. Linda's eyes softened slightly, but her voice remained steady. You deserved better than that. You still do. There was no pity in her words, only acknowledgement, and that made them land differently. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition. I think I have been adjusting for a long time, I said, my voice even, almost detached, making space for changes that were never really explained. Linda gave a small, knowing look. Some people do not explain things when silence works better for them. I followed her gaze again toward the table, watching Ashley laugh at something one of her friends said, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm as if everything around her belonged exactly where it was. "She has been careful," I said quietly. "Careful enough that I could always tell myself it was nothing." Linda nodded. "That is how it works. Not all at once. Just enough each time that you question yourself instead of them." For the first time that day, I felt something shift, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but internally, like a door closing on one version of understanding and opening to another. I was no longer trying to interpret what had happened. I was seeing it clearly. Linda reached out and briefly touched my arm. A simple gesture, steady and grounding. "You are not invisible, Margaret," she said. "They just hoped you would accept being treated that way." I looked at her, then back at the house, at the yard, at the carefully arranged pieces of a life I had once believed I was at the center of. "I do not think I will be adjusting anymore," I replied, my voice calm, almost quiet, but certain in a way it had not been before. Linda held my gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, as if she understood exactly what that meant, even though I had not explained it. And I realized I did not need to explain it. Not to her, not to anyone. The sky had started to dim slightly by the time I walked toward my car, the soft orange light of late afternoon stretching across the driveway, quieting everything that had felt so loud just an hour before. I did not say goodbye. There did not seem to be a reason to. No one called out my name. No one asked if I was leaving, and that absence felt more honest than any polite exchange would have been. My footsteps were steady against the pavement, each one measured, unhurried, as if I had all the time in the world, even though something inside me had already moved on. I placed my hand on the car door, but did not open it right away. Instead, I turned slightly and looked back at the house, at the yard where the decorations still swayed gently in the breeze, at the table now mostly cleared, reduced to paper plates stacked in uneven piles and half-empty cups left behind. From this distance, it looked smaller, not physically, but in a way that made everything that had happened feel contained, almost insignificant, as if it belonged to a version of my life I was no longer standing inside. I could still hear Ashley's voice faintly, carrying through the open back door, light and controlled, already moving on to the next conversation, the next detail, the next moment where she remained at the center. Daniel's voice followed, quieter, less distinct, blending into hers in a way that felt familiar, predictable. I wondered briefly when that shift had fully taken place, when his voice had stopped standing on its own and started aligning with hers so completely. But the question did not linger. It did not need to. I opened the car door and sat inside, closing it gently behind me, letting the quiet settle in around me like a separate world. No laughter, no background noise, just the soft ticking of the engine as it cooled and the distant hum of a neighborhood continuing its day. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and stared straight ahead, not thinking in the way I once would have, not replaying conversations or searching for explanations. That part of me had already gone still. In its place was something clearer, more defined, a kind of understanding that did not require emotion to hold it together. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling briefly through the screen until I found the contact I was looking for. It had been saved there for years, rarely used, but never deleted. The number of a lawyer who had once helped my husband and me organize everything we had built together, back when planning ahead had felt like a responsible act, not a necessary one. My thumb hovered for just a second before I pressed call. The line rang once, then twice, and then a calm, professional voice answered on the other end. I spoke simply, without hesitation, without explanation. I asked for an appointment. Soon. As soon as possible. When the call ended, I placed the phone back in my purse and sat there for another moment, looking out through the windshield, watching the quiet street stretch ahead of me. Nothing around me had changed. The houses were the same. The trees, the sidewalks, the soft movement of the evening air. But something had shifted completely and without noise, in a way no one else would notice until it was already done. I started the engine, backed out slowly, and drove away without looking back again. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet that settles into a house when nothing is expected and nothing is waiting. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window in thin, steady lines, landing across the counter where I had already placed a cup of coffee, untouched, growing cooler by the minute. I sat at the table longer than usual, not out of hesitation, but because there was no longer any urgency tied to my routine. For years, my days had been shaped around others, around calls, visits, reminders, small responsibilities that gave structure to everything else. That structure was gone now, not suddenly, but completely. And in its absence, there was space. Clear, uninterrupted space. I reached for the folder I had taken out the night before, the one I had not opened in a long time. The edges were slightly worn, the papers inside neatly arranged, exactly as we had left them years ago when everything was first put into place. My husband had insisted on it back then, saying it was better to be prepared, better to decide things calmly rather than leave them uncertain. At the time, it had felt like a formality, something responsible, but distant, something we would not need to revisit anytime soon. I opened the folder slowly, flipping through pages that detailed everything we had built, everything we had set aside, every decision made with care and intention. Names were listed clearly, allocations defined, roles assigned. It was all there, structured, balanced, fair. I paused on one page longer than the others, reading it again, not because I did not understand it, but because I was seeing it differently now. Back then, it had been written with trust as its foundation, with the assumption that relationships would remain steady, that respect would not need to be questioned. That assumption no longer applied. I closed the folder gently and placed it flat on the table, aligning it with the edge as if precision still mattered, even in small things. Then I stood, walked to the kitchen drawer, and took out a pen. It was the same kind I had used for grocery lists, for birthday cards, for notes left on the counter over the years. Simple, ordinary. I returned to the table and sat down again, the folder open in front of me, the pen resting lightly in my hand. I did not rush. I did not hesitate. I made a small mark next to a name, then another, each movement steady, deliberate, not driven by emotion, but by clarity. There was no anger in what I was doing. No need for it. This was not a reaction. It was an adjustment, a correction of something that had been built on an understanding that no longer existed. When I finished, I closed the folder once more and set it aside, exactly where it had been before, only now it carried a different weight. The house remained quiet around me, unchanged, but I felt the shift settle in fully, like a decision that had already moved beyond the point of reconsideration. I picked up my coffee, now lukewarm, and took a slow sip, not minding the temperature, not needing anything to be perfect. Outside, the day continued as it always did, cars passing, neighbors going about their routines, unaware that anything had changed. And that was the way it would remain, at least for now, because the kind of change I had just made did not announce itself. It revealed itself later, when it was already too late to question. The appointment was scheduled for 2 days later, at 10 in the morning, a time that once would have felt too early for something so serious, but now felt precise, appropriate, almost expected. I arrived 5 minutes ahead, not out of nervousness, but out of habit, the kind that had been built over years of respecting time, of showing up prepared. The office looked exactly as I remembered it, quiet, orderly, everything in its place, as if nothing within those walls ever shifted without intention. When I sat down across from Mr. Henderson, he greeted me with the same calm professionalism I had always known, but there was a slight pause in his expression when he realized why I was there. "It has been a while, Margaret," he said, folding his hands on the desk. I nodded once. "It has." I placed the folder in front of him, sliding it forward with steady hands. He opened it carefully, scanning the pages, his eyes moving with practiced attention, absorbing the details without interruption. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was focused, measured. He stopped at the marked sections, the small changes I had made, and looked up at me, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet confirmation. "You are certain about this?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of finality. I did not answer immediately, not because I needed time, but because I wanted the answer to be as clear as the decision itself. "Yes," I said, my voice even, steady, without strain. "I am not removing anything out of anger. I am correcting something that no longer reflects reality." He held my gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledges both the legal and the personal without needing to separate the two. "Understood," he replied, turning back to the documents. "We will update everything accordingly. Once it is signed and filed, the changes will stand." I watched as he made notes, as he adjusted the structure we had once built together, not undoing it entirely, but reshaping it into something that matched what now existed, not what had once been assumed. There was no tension in the room, no raised voices, no sense of conflict. Just a quiet, deliberate process, carried out with the same care that had originally created it. When the documents were finalized, he turned them toward me, indicating where I needed to sign. I picked up the pen, the same steady motion as before, and signed each page without hesitation, my name settling into place with a clarity that felt complete. When it was done, I closed the folder and stood, thanking him briefly, not out of obligation, but because the moment deserved acknowledgement. As I stepped out of the office and into the late morning light, nothing around me appeared different. The street moved as it always did, people passing by, cars slowing at the corner, the ordinary rhythm of a day continuing without pause. But beneath that, something had already shifted, fully and irreversibly, in a way that would not be visible yet, but would soon become impossible to ignore. A week passed before the call came, not rushed, not urgent, but timed in a way that suggested confidence rather than concern. I was in the kitchen when my phone rang. The same quiet space, the same filtered light, everything unchanged on the surface. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I let it ring once more before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that timing, like everything else, had its place. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a tone I had not heard in a long time, something uncertain, something searching. "I got a call from Mr. Henderson's office." I did not respond immediately. I let the silence settle between us, giving his words room to exist without interruption. "He said there were changes made." Daniel continued, slower now, more careful. "Significant ones." I could picture him standing somewhere in his home, perhaps in the kitchen or near the living room window, holding his phone a little tighter than usual, trying to understand something that no longer aligned with his expectations. "Yes," I said finally, my voice calm, even, the same tone I had used throughout the entire process. There was a pause on the other end, longer this time. "I do not understand," he said, and there it was, not anger, not accusation, just confusion, the kind that comes when something assumed to be permanent is quietly removed. I thought everything was already decided. I turned slightly, looking out the window, watching a car pass slowly down the street, ordinary, unaffected. "It was," I replied, "at a time when things were different." Another pause. This one heavier, as if he was trying to find the right question, the one that would restore what he believed had been lost. "Is this about the party?" he asked, his voice lowering, almost cautious. I let that question sit for a moment, not because it needed an answer, but because it revealed something important. He thought it was about a single moment. A single day? "No," I said quietly. "It is not about one afternoon." I could feel the shift on the other end of the line, the realization beginning to form, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to change the direction of his thoughts. "Then what is it about?" he asked, softer now. I rested my hand lightly against the counter, grounding myself in the present, not the past. "It is about clarity," I said, "about recognizing where I stand and adjusting accordingly." He did not respond right away, and in that silence, I understood something I had not needed to confirm before. He had never truly seen it. Not the pattern, not the gradual distance, not the quiet decisions that had been made without me. "Ashley said it was just a misunderstanding," he added after a moment, the words careful, almost rehearsed. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of amusement, but of recognition. "I am sure that is what she believes," I said. "But misunderstandings do not repeat themselves so precisely." The line grew quiet again, and this time it was different. Not searching, not uncertain, just still. "So that is it?" he asked eventually, his voice low, as if he was standing at the edge of something he did not fully understand. I looked out at the street once more, at the steady movement of a day that continued regardless of personal shifts. "No," I said gently. "That is simply where it began." I ended the call shortly after, not abruptly, not coldly, but with the same calm finality that had carried me through every step of this process. I placed the phone back on the counter and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet around me, feeling the absence of urgency, of expectation, of anything that required me to explain further. Outside, nothing had changed. But inside, everything had already settled into place, exactly where it now belonged.